Mr. Chairman, there are 13 ayes and 9 noes.
The motion to table
Mr. Chairman,
passes. Yes, who seeks recognition?
I seek to strike the last, I move to strike the last word.
The ranking member is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, in this last amendment by Ms. Scanlon that was just ruled out of order, you ruled it out of order because it references a specific date. In my parliamentary universe, adding a specific date is considered a limiting amendment. It limits the scope of the underlying amendment. It does not expand it. Therefore, it cannot be a grounds for holding an amendment out of order because it limits it. It doesn't expand it. It's called in parliamentary terms a limiting amendment, which is always permitted. So this is just another example of the Republicans using obviously specious reasoning because you're afraid to vote on anything to do with January 6th. You're afraid to vote on all the things we've talked about before because your constituents might hold you responsible. So I would ask you why this is not a limiting amendment. Why this, in what way this expands the scope of the amendment, and I'll yield to you for the purpose.
I'll be happy to answer. We will belabor the point further. I've already explained this, that by presenting this amendment, it changes the purpose of the bill and makes it about January 6th. On its face, by your explanations, by all the comments that have been made, you want this to be about January 6th. You just said it again. You emphasize the same point. That's not what the underlying legislation is about.
Reclaiming my time.
You asked me to respond, and I'm giving you a response. Okay, so on its face, the amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7. Now, you can disagree with me, but you're not the chairman anymore. I'm sitting in the chair now.
Reclaiming my time. I certainly do disagree with you. And again, I repeat that the motives of the Republicans today are shameful as seeking only to avoid voting on all these different subjects that have been raised today. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Would the gentleman yield? The gentleman has yielded back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Ms. Cicilline, and then I'll get to you, Ms. Johnson.
I have an amendment, so I think Mr. Johnson wants to speak with respect to this, so I'm happy to defer to him.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. The blatant hypocrisy on display throughout this hearing is mind-numbing, Mr. Chairman. It's very disappointing that the intellectual dishonesty that is on display is shockingly abusive to the process. I mean, you can't tell the American people who are looking at this that to include federal law enforcement officers in a resolution honoring the service of local and state law enforcement officers is irrelevant or non-germane or out of order in some way. The American people understand that law enforcement is law enforcement. They understand that January 6th, Capitol Hill police officers died. They understand that federal law enforcement officers over the years have died. Actually 650 have died from gunfire over the years. 650 have died from gunfire, federal law enforcement officers. Not to mention the 7 fallen officers of the U.S. Capitol Police Department, 2 of whom have passed away within the last 2 years due to the insurrection. And so we've had law enforcement officers, federal law enforcement officers, who've given their lives to protect us. They were the ultimate displays of courage. But yet this committee doesn't have the courage to vote up or down a germane amendment that simply seeks to add federal law enforcement officers to this resolution. It's simple. The American people understand it. They're not getting thrown off track by talking about crime. And by the way, the crime that you speak of is caused by your policies in opening the floodgates for more guns on the street. This is a failed experiment. More guns does not mean more safe. More guns means less safe. But yet, the response of the Republicans is always more guns. We should be, instead of a resolution to honor police today, just state and local, we should actually be using our time to make our police officers and to make the citizens of this country more safe by limiting guns, by reversing the trend that you all have started and that you continue to adhere to that makes us less safe. It's ridiculous that we would honor police officers at a time when we're making them less safe and refusing to do anything about it other than to offer prayers and to talk about how brave they are when they respond to the next mass casualty event, which could be taking place right as we speak and could be confronted by federal law enforcement officers coming to the aid of state and local officers. Every mass shooting that we have seen has involved a response by the FBI and the ATF, but yet you want to defund those two agencies. So we've been doing a lot of talking today. The American people see through it. If we're gonna honor police, let's honor our state, local, and federal police. Moreover, let's get past these messaging bills and let's start doing what the American people want us to do, and that is pass some gun reform legislation to keep our communities safe. Democrats have been making our communities safer, voting on legislation to make our communities safer, while Republicans have been stopping the legislation either in the House or in the Senate. It's time for it to end. It's time for the killing to stop. It's time for the philosophy of more guns means more safety to go by the wayside. Less guns will make us more safe. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair is going to respond to the outrageous claim that there's hypocrisy going on here. All the clutching of pearls is so far out of order, and I'm going to clarify the record here for anyone who's watching at home, high school students who are studying civics, and some on this committee who should understand the rules. The rule is, again, let me state very simply what the rule is. House Rule 16, Clause 7 says that an amendment cannot introduce material beyond the scope and purpose of the bill before us. Let me tell you why the last amendment, by way of example, was ruled out of order. I've already explained this again, but I'll give you further detail. Ms. Scanlon's amendment says on page 2, strike all that follows in the underlying bill after the resolving clause and insert the following, that Congress acknowledges the United States Capitol attack on January 6, 2021. The underlying bill says something very different. It says, be it resolved that Congress recognizes and appreciates the dedication and devotion demonstrated by the men and women of local law enforcement who keep our communities safe, and 2, condemns calls to defund, disband, and dismantle or abolish the police. The reason, everybody watching at home, the reason that they're so anxious to change the language of the underlying legislation is because of the last sentence that I just read you, that last clause, because this resolution condemns calls to defund, disband, dismantle, or abolish the police. They're all on record, including the ranking member who just clutched his pearls and told me that I was out of order here.
Would the gentleman
he is
yield?
on record saying that he wanted to defund the police. I'm not going to yield. You guys have talked enough. And you've all accused us of abusing the rules. This amendment, just like the ones before it, is a blatant violation of House Rule 16, Clause 7. It is not germane because it wants to talk about January 6th and it wants to get rid of the condemnation of the call to defund police, which was their mantra here until just recently.
Would the gentleman
Because now we've seen the results.
Mr. Chairman, will you yield to
The
a
chair
question?
does not yield. I will yield if you have an amendment. No, I'm not going to yield to a question. No, you've talked enough, Mr. Cicilline.
You don't get to decide that, Mr. Chairman. You don't get to decide who talked enough.
It's my time and I'm not yielding.
Okay, then I ask.